So how will you, as a foreigner, be perceived by Colombians when in Colombia? Hi all, I'm Ezrado and you're watching my travel channel where I talk all things Colombia. Today I thought I'd explore a popular question from expats who travel to Colombia, and that is, how will I be perceived by Colombians? You may have heard a broad spectrum of opinions from various outspoken people on this. Some are adamant that you'll be treated like royalty as a foreigner, whilst others seem to think that we've been marred by negative stereotypes. Having lived in Colombia for almost a year myself, I thought I'd bring my thoughts to the table here, so without further ado, let's get straight into it. Right off the bat, gotta say that personally, the reaction that most Colombians have had towards me has been one of legitimate intrigue, likely for the novelty of me being an Australian, a nationality you don't see much of in Colombia. Admittedly, there is an upside to being specifically an Aussie in Colombia, and that is that in some respects, you do have a blank slate with most people. By that I mean that when people find out that I'm Australian, they don't have all these preconceived notions as to what I must be like, quite simply because, again, there aren't many Australians living in Colombia, and so we haven't been able to generate any kind of stereotypes about our country. Anyway, that's Australia, but you might be wondering what the prevailing narrative about your country is. Well, I'll talk about the US in a moment, but first I gotta say that if you're from anywhere other than the US, Latin America, or Spain, then you'll probably have a very similar experience to me as an Australian. Something I've come to notice during my time in Colombia is that there don't seem to be many deeply embedded beliefs and stereotypes about every country of the world. There might be some iconic things from your country that people are aware of, like the kangaroos in Australia for instance, but in terms of how the people of your country are perceived, I would say that it has less to do with your country in particular and more to do with the fact that you are a foreigner in general, but I'll get to that in a bit. Now obviously I am generalizing here because, I have met some other people who are more knowledgeable about specific cultures, including my own, but this is usually if they have a specialist interest in it, like if they're thinking of moving there or their children live there, for example. I should note though, if you're from one of the neighbouring Latin American countries, you can probably throw out everything I've just said. Venezuela, Panama and Ecuador, for instance, have had some significant history with Colombia, once actually being part of the same country. In terms of residency, there's also a reasonable portion of Venezuelans living in Colombia right now too, many of whom are refugees. So yeah, because of this and just the simple fact that these countries are close to Colombia, you will find that people are often more familiar with them compared to other countries of the world. That being said, if you're from the US, people do seem to carry perhaps a few more preconceived notions of your country and culture compared to most others. As we all know, the US is one of these countries that people all over the world seem pretty familiar with, largely due to their historic political power and of course their many exports in entertainment particularly. As far as Colombia goes, there's definitely been quite a checkered history of US and Colombia relations throughout the years, including the US's involvement in liberating Panama from the country, and their relatively heavy investment and corporate presence in the country dating back to the early 1900s. It should be noted that a lot of this history is distant enough now to where it doesn't seem to have a huge impact on how Colombians see Gringos today, but there's definitely still a lot more history there than between any other non-Spanish country. Also, if you take a look at Colombia today, people from the US make up the second largest expat community in the country, right after Venezuelans. There are tens of thousands of Yanks in Colombia, a number that no other country other than Venezuela even comes close to. Because of this, it's common for Colombians to just assume that you're from the US if they see you're not Latin American, which brings me to probably the most important point of this video. See, in terms of Colombia's perception of foreigners outside of Latam and Spain in the country, a lot of it is heavily influenced by the US expats, as due to their presence, this is the biggest point of reference by a large margin. What this means is that as much as I might not have to wrestle with stereotypes of Australia specifically, I do still have to wrestle with the broader perception of gringos in general. I realise that as an Australian, I'm technically not a gringo, but I am still a foreigner, and therefore, for many Colombians, the cultural perception of me isn't going to be much different. This is one of the biggest differences I've noticed on this topic between Colombia and many developed Western countries. Here in Australia, for instance, we have large communities from all over the world living here, and so the perceptions and stereotypes we have tend to differ quite dramatically for every culture. Colombia, on the other hand, is not a multicultural country at all, at least not in terms of international community. If you were to ask someone what their perception was of, say, people from the Netherlands or Greece or New Zealand, well, they're not going to have much of a point of reference because they've most likely never met a person from any of those countries, and they don't have much presence in the cultural zeitgeist. So instead, it's much easier to just categorize people like me as simply extranjeros, meaning foreigners, and this broader categorization becomes the default subject of perceptions, beliefs, and stereotypes. With that in mind, the question here shouldn't be what do Colombians think of people from my country specifically, so much as what do Colombians think of foreigners in general. In answering this though, I do have a few interesting points to share. First of all, to address the elephant in the room, yes, the drug trade in Colombia that causes all sorts of problems for its citizens is propped up in most part by the exportation of these substances to other countries. So yes, there inevitably are going to be some people who hold a bit of a grudge against foreigners for this, possibly more so if the trade has had direct negative effect on their life, like displacement for instance. My piece of advice here therefore would be to take a firm stand if people ever ask you if you take these drugs. Make it clear that you're not the kind of person who engages in this kind of thing. Unless of course you are, in which case you should obviously stop. Another foreigner-induced issue though that Colombia currently faces is gentrification, as a result of many people from the States moving to the country. If you didn't know, gentrification is a problem that occurs when a lot of relatively wealthy people move into an area, eventually causing the cost of living to rise in response to this, forcing the original residents who can no longer afford things to move out. This issue seems to be the most pronounced in Medellin, where neighborhoods like El Poblado and Laureles have become major hotspots for expats, even in comparison to anywhere else in South America. Of course, Bogotá as the country's capital, and Cartagena as an idealized tourist haven are also subject to this issue, albeit not quite to the extent of Medellin. As you'd imagine, this can cause a negative impression of expats, particularly in the areas where it's most common. With that in mind, I do think it's important to be aware of the footprint you're leaving if you're living in Colombia, trying not to perpetuate this issue. It's totally your call, but my advice would be to live in an area where there aren't many expats or tourists, and one that's also unlikely to see a whole lot of growth in its foreign community. Basically, the more discreet we are, the less the market reacts to our presence, and beyond minimizing displacements, this will also help the greater cultural perception of us. On top of that, it goes without saying that you should also be trying to be as humble and appreciative as possible towards Colombians, as there definitely are instances, particularly in those wealthy neighborhoods, where expats act entitled and expect everything and everyone around them to fit what they're used to back at home. Given the gentrification issue, this arrogance only adds insult to injury, so that's something you should be conscious of. Again, when you meet Colombians, try and be as polite and appreciative of their time and hospitality as you can be. I find that if you show some genuine kindness, it's unlikely that people are going to hold a grudge against you just for being a foreigner. Some people might still assume you're kinda rich, which can be an annoying assumption, but thankfully it rarely seems to affect how people treat you. I guess the exceptions to this would be when it comes to safety, as it does mean that you'll be a more valued target of robberies if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, like I once was. You can hear that story in another video I did here. Anyway, so far it might sound like it's all going to be an uphill battle trying to win people over, but don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom. See, in certain contexts, particularly when it comes to hospitality, you may find that people really appreciate you and go above and beyond in trying to please you. I often notice this when I go to eat out at restaurants. The person serving me will often be very attentive, asking me how the food was and telling me to let them know if there's anything more I need. Now, you might chalk that up to them trying to get a good tip from me, but from what I understand, restaurant workers in Colombia don't rely on tips to make up the bulk of their income like you'll often see in the US. It is still customary to tip, but it's usually a fixed service charge of 10%, which they'll add to the bill. In other words, despite technically being optional, it's more of a set procedure that most people will do, as opposed to a discretionary thing where the restaurant workers are trying to goodwill you into tipping them a high amount. In my opinion, the true reason for the attentive service is more likely to do with the fact that they simply want to leave a good impression. See, one thing I've learned about Colombians over the years is that many put a lot of thought into how they present themselves to others. This is true on both a personal level and also a cultural level, by which I mean that Colombians want you to have a good impression of their country. Restaurants are a good example where you'll likely notice this. Obviously, they don't want you to walk away with a bad impression where you form some idea that food in Colombia isn't good, nor do they want you to form any bad impressions of themselves personally. That might sound like a given in most countries of the world, but I'd say that in Colombia, it's a bit more pronounced. That said, this isn't always the case, as I've certainly come across service workers who are far more apathetic, but if you're in a dine-in restaurant that isn't a fast food chain, it is something you might notice. Still, it is worth pointing out that, as with anywhere, the opposite extreme definitely still exists in Colombia too. You will find people who really don't care at all what you think of them, and in extreme cases are a lot more concerned with what they can get from you. Admittedly, from a social perspective, I'm not exactly one to fraternize, and so personally I've avoided making friends with people who aren't so trustworthy. For people who travel to the country for less savoury reasons though, or are a little more liberal about the crowds they mix with, their risk of becoming the target of some form of subterfuge is obviously going to be higher. There definitely are certain people in the country who like to take advantage of foreigners, oftentimes for financial reasons, or in the case of the infamous gringo hunter, getting with you purely so they can eventually usurp residency in your country. Although these extreme cases may be the stories you hear the most though, I really want to clarify that they are not the norm. The average Colombian is not like this at all. Honestly, I don't think it's hard to avoid these kinds of superficial people. Like, you can generally sniff them out a mile away, and those who can't probably aren't the best judges of character. As far as the general populace of Colombia goes though, I ultimately believe that you'll be in good company with people who are genuinely happy to meet you and want the best for you. Anyway, I think I've covered about everything that comes to mind on this topic, but I hope I was able to shed some light on it for you. That'll do it for today, but if you have any questions about this, go ahead and leave them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this, feel free to like, subscribe, bell, leave a suggestion for a video topic if you want, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao!